Hello, and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy, and today we're going to look at third-party risk management. We also have a special guest as part of this topic, Scott Fairbrother from Down Under, whom we'll hear from in a bit. So you don't have to listen to me talk the whole time. As always, please subscribe to our podcast, follow us on LinkedIn, and share with your fellow security leaders. In today's digital world, it's very common to use third-party applications. Just think about how many organizations send sensitive data outside their borders to places like Salesforce, Microsoft 365, GitHub, ServiceNow, Jira, Dropbox, Workday, QuickBooks. Yeah, you could go on and on. Well, companies can outsource your company's data. You can't outsource the accountability for keeping your company's data secure. Let me repeat that. As a CISO, you cannot outsource accountability. That's why it's important to use a third-party risk management solution. Now, on today's episode, we want you to listen to and understand three important questions. Number one, how do you identify which vendors pose the highest risk to your business? Could you answer that to the satisfaction of your executive team right now? Number two, how do you see which vendors' security controls protect against threats? And how do you validate their risk profiles by scanning or dark web monitoring or some other technique that correlates to what attackers are seeing and acting upon? And then number three, do you have an understanding of how to improve risk mitigation in your third-party ecosystem? Now, these are not trivial questions because let's start out with taking a look at some recent stuff that's happened last year or so. Now, Volkswagen Group of America, which includes Audi, lost 3.3 million records as a result of a third-party vendor that left their information exposed for 21 months, all the way up to about May of 2021. General Electric lost over 200,000 records of employee data. And healthcare organization Organon had a report of public data breach when a laptop was stolen from a contractor facility. And then online services like Instagram and YouTube, hundreds of millions of records from a social media data broker named Deep Social that went out of business as a result of this. And for those who like to travel, Expedia, Hotels.com lost over 10 million customer records when its third-party prestige software left its data in an S3 bucket and, left it public. This would go on and on with these things, so this is not a make-believe type of a problem. This exists right now. Great Horn conducted a survey of 250 U.S. cybersecurity pros in March and reported in their supply chain cyber attack report, which just came out in July of 2021. 58% of organizations reported they experienced some attempted supply chain attack last year. 76% have supply chain cyber attack mitigation plans. Are you part of that? Or are you part of the 24% who don't? How about this? 80% require vendors and suppliers to implement a security framework. All right, what framework do you require your vendors to implement? Okay, if you don't have an instant answer like that, you need to keep listening. And then of organizations that fell victim to attack, 79% of them suffered financial damage with an average of over $6 million for the loss. Now, what we're seeing is third parties create risks to companies in multiple ways. Strategic risk, of course, from a perspective of mergers and acquisitions, it turns out that something goes horribly wrong or it could throw the price off for those of us who remember Verizon's purchase of Yahoo. And then after the deal went through, Yahoo said, oh yeah, by the way, we lost about 3 billion records. Does that kind of affect the deal? Oh yeah. Reputational risk, as you end up with potential lawsuits against the brands of the third parties and customers just saying, hey, I don't want to deal with them because of that. Operational risk. Disaster recovery, business continuity plans don't work anymore because of the fact that something is outside of your control that you depend upon. The legal risk, the terms and conditions of the contract, and of course, somebody lawyering up on you for that one. Compliance risk with respect to regulatory requirements. And of course, the information security risk on data privacy and protection. Don't forget, there's a financial risk that goes along with all of these. Willis Towers Watson analyzed the cyber insurance industry to identify the most common root cause of cyber attacks. And the study found the most common attack type was phishing at 29%. And second most common attack type was security breach of third parties, which is 24%. Hmm. Now, we probably have programs in place to work with phishing. I don't know of any self respecting CISO who doesn't have something in place. It could be security awareness training, periodic phishing exercises, but we do something to ensure that our users who can click on things, open stuff, find USB drives and insert them, don't do dumb stuff. Well, if that's at 29% and third parties are 24%, that's roughly a quarter of all the cyber attacks are third party data breaches. And therefore, we need to provide that same level of rigor as we do for phishing controls. For example, today, most organizations will do your monthly phishing exercises. You'll teach your users about that. But do you have a monthly contact with your users to ensure they follow your third party risk management program? Do you contact your third parties on a regular basis to see how they're doing? Now, we don't want to go ahead and create sort of a nanny state. You're not going to be trying to tell them how to run their business. I certainly don't want one of my customers trying to tell me how to do my job. But I do need to provide them with a level of confidence and assurance that I am doing my job and I'm doing my job well enough that we're controlling risk to an acceptable level. See, perhaps the biggest need for third party risk management is establishing due care. When we think about that in the event of a large data breach, lawyers, regulators, investors all look at a company for the possibility of negligence. And if you didn't meet best practices, external entities are going to sue or place a punishment, try to harm your company or resources. And therefore, your security teams constantly need to show that they performed at a reasonable level of due diligence to safeguard sensitive data. Now, for example, today, it's quite common to use a questionnaire to look at vendor risk. For example, the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire, or CAIQ, is that pronounced cake? Maybe. From the Cloud Security Alliance is a free questionnaire used to identify best practices which are commonly used. And each questionnaire puts the vendors through a series of detailed questions that determine deficiencies in their cyber practices. And if a deficiency is identified, then organizations need to either accept, reject, transfer, or mitigate that risk that's posed by that potential problem or threat. Another key aspect we see companies doing is asking for a third-party review. Essentially, companies are incentivized to earn your business, so they could create cyber policies as a response to a standardized information gathering, or SIG, or a cake, without really implementing them. Remember, it doesn't help if your patch policy says, we patch in 30 days, if no one's following it. And so therefore, companies also and often may ask for third-party reviews, external reviews of your third parties to ensure due diligence. Now, some examples might include an ISO 27001 report, a SOC 2 Type 2, or the result of a pen test. And some organizations make these generally available to their customers and even prospective customers when they ask for it. I've done that as part of due diligence, where I go to a company and they said, oh yeah, here's your SOC 2 Type 2. And boom, you get the whole report. I get to read it as a CISO, as the expert, and then come back to my management team and say, yay, verily, I don't see any major risk problems as of the day this report was written. Yeah. And of course, you got to qualify it that way too, because there's a problem later on. They'll come back to you and said, hey, you said this was good, but he said, yeah, it was good on the date of that particular pen test or that particular report. So keep that in mind. It's a fluid situation. Now, companies can also be performing some sort of security scan on a vendor. You could look at a public website for vulnerabilities. Now, again, without poking in there and breaking into stuff, there's certain things that you can scan externally that don't require permission. It's certainly well within the law and well within reasonable nature. For example, if you connect to a public website and there's insecure versions of JavaScript being turned up, or they use deprecated versions of TLS or worse, SSL 3.0, then it might be logical to assume the internal products may be bad as well, or could be even worse. Now, in addition to compliance, we also need to think about third-party risk management as an enabler of effective risk management. I mean, for example, if I had 100 different vendors with different types of risks, how do I document and track each of them so I don't miss any remediation activities? For example, let's say my vendor didn't have SAML authentication currently, but promised you that he would deliver this feature within 3 months. Now, who or what person or tool or process in your organization is responsible for tracking this event to make sure it becomes implemented on that particular month and then validates that? Now, here's another thought. If a vendor discloses a public data breach, how would you know? And if you did know, would you immediately cut off their access to your network? What if this IT service company had VPN access to service your critical data? And then are we collecting and collating all this data that we have from hundreds of assessments? And can we identify which third party is the potential weakest link of the supply chain and showing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by, I don't know, something like ransomware? Remember, if you fail to take timely action on cyber risks, you could be held negligent to your stakeholders, or at least considered that way. And that's usually bad enough. We need to use risk assessments on third party vendors to tell our executive management which vendors pose the highest risk to our organizations. Now, every business has to take some risks, it's part of the game. But cyber and doing our job effectively is about allowing our leaders to make informed, risk based decisions. It's up to cybersecurity to inform the business how big the risk is, how expensive it gets when it goes bad, what steps could be taken to reduce the risk, and how much does it cost to remediate the risk when possible. Remember, effective cyber offers the organization revenue protection. You want to enhance your organization's ability and agility through digital transformation. So, finding comprehensive ways to create visibility on risks allows your management and your leadership team to stay informed. Okay, as I promised, I'd like to introduce you now to somebody who's been looking at this problem space for an extended period of time, someone whom I think has some great lessons learned to share with us. So let's go ahead and go over to the interview portion of our show. And today I'm privileged to have in our virtual studios, because he's coming to us from Australia, Scott Fairbrother from Telstra. Scott, glad to have you on the show. And can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Thank you, G-Mark. Yes, well, I started out in, I guess, the telecom space, mainly around transmission switching, radio, satellite engineering. Moved into sort of product engineering role. While I was doing that, as a very young and naive fellow up for a challenge, I joined the Army Reserves and got into signals, and probably first had my exposure to crypto in those days in a very manual way. Soon joined security operations within Telstra, moved into the consulting area, spent a lot of time as an enterprise security architect working for government and enterprise customers globally. And now back into a security operations role again, with a main focus on what we call partner security, so basically third-party risk management.
Interesting. Now, you said you work for Telstra. By the way, just for the audience, this is our fourth take on the interview because the first three kept dying because of bandwidth. And so Scott went to his Telstra mobile and it's working beautifully. So 2 thumbs up there for your company. This is going to give you, we're not plugging them, but if you're in Australia, that's, I guess, the firm to have.
I would like to think I'm working for the right telco. So yes, they've done me proud on this session. Thanks, Jim.
That's well done. Yeah, and again, thank you for the background because you've done a lot, and that's important because I love having people on the show who've got a lot of experience with a lot of different areas and things such as that. And as you'd mentioned, your responsibility over there on third-party security, which is interesting because we've been talking about that for the first part of the show. I mean, vendor risk isn't exactly a new risk. The cloud's fairly new. We're figuring stuff out, but vendor risk has been around for decades, really. But what is it about vendor risk that makes it so hard for organizations to solve?
It's always, and there's a lot of similarities certainly with vendor risk. And ultimately, in cybersecurity, all comes back to our assets. So, what assets are we trying to protect? How are we trying to manage where our information and facilities are? How are we managing who has access to that information and facilities? So with third parties, and in our space, so we like to use that term partners. So for us as an organization, third parties mean anything from the customer right through to the manufacturer. So any entity or organization that has an involvement with Telstra, that shares our information or accesses our facilities. So because of all of those third party interactions, we're obviously going to have less control over some of those assets. So third party access, it extends that perimeter. It potentially weakens those trust boundaries that we have in place beyond the firewall. It increases our data footprint, and therefore it's increasing our threat profile. So the key, I guess, for us is to understand what those third party relationships are and aim to manage those relationships so that we understand what they're doing with our assets.
Yeah, and that's an interesting challenge because I don't think any organization can do everything themselves. And as a result, we tend to look over to our partners, as you had said, third parties who will be doing things for various levels of complexity, either from operational details like a managed security service provider to a handling all the sensitive information about our customers, our employees, our financials, et cetera. So there's a lot out there that we end up having to essentially share. And I think part of the difficulty is from managing that is that you could go in and you can take a snapshot of what does your security look like, and they may look quite well, nice. But as you had said from your army experience, you all know what happens when the general's coming. Everybody gets themselves all polished up for an inspection. It looks great, and then the next day it's back to normal again. So any ideas that you might have in terms of companies doing more to safeguard themselves about third party risks, since you can't really inspect them every single day?
You're correct. You do have to have your eyes on the ball all of the time. You need to have a broad view of about what your relationships are. Most organizations can't do business without some involvement of third parties. So, as a service provider, you might rely on lots of different vendors providing support to the services that you're offering to customers. As a retail organization, you're reliant on the supply chain for the products that you sell. So we all have relationships with third parties. Sometimes those third parties are enforced relationships, and so things like our regulatory environment. So we do need to understand what those exposures are. I guess coming back to risk management, you start with the assets. So I like to think it's about understanding the who, what, where, why, how, and when. So who are your partners? Getting a handle on who those partners are is probably the biggest challenge an organization's going to have. What do they have access to? So think about what facilities physically you might have partners accessing, what data do they need to access to assist you in what they're doing for your business. Think about where those partners are located, because that will translate to where your data is. Don't forget the data sovereignty requirements that we have across the globe. Obviously, in some countries, there's a whole aspect called extrajudicial direction, and that's where a company or a government has a right over a company to access their data. So there are certain areas throughout the globe that we need to be a little bit careful of in terms of where that data ends up, because we might lose control. We may have no legal recourse in terms of where that data ends up. Have a think about how those third parties are accessing that data. What sort of technology do they use? Are they using VPNs? Are they using appropriate multi-factor authentication on their endpoint clients? Are you protecting your data stream? And once it ends up somewhere within that third party's organization, do they have the appropriate controls across their enterprise to manage your data? ideally, the 101 of risk management, you try and eliminate the risk wherever possible. So if you can reduce where that data footprint is by putting requirements on your third parties, by putting technical controls in place, then that's ultimately where you want to get to. It's difficult to, I guess, sometimes get a big picture of what that looks like without assistance from services that might help you do that job better than what you can internally. Have a think about under what situations those third parties are accessing your data, how much of that can be locked down. We have a view, and I guess my view is that it's a partner ecosystem. It's not just a sequential supply chain. So think of it as a multi-dimensional, multi-directional ecosystem with your upstream suppliers right through to your downstream customers, and also those side stream relationships with the regulators I mentioned, with your industry peers. As an organisation, if you're undergoing mergers and acquisitions with other organisations, we need to be doing appropriate due diligence with those M&A targets as well. Have a think about your sales channels and your distributors. What information do they have from you to help you sell your services, but also vice versa? What information from your customers do they retain, and how do they manage that information? And lastly, think about how the risks associated with those relationships, how they need to be managed at a business level. So as a cybersecurity organisation, I like to think we're here as a service provider within our organisation. We're here to provide that expertise back to our stakeholders. So whether that's the board or leadership in a government organisation, the business needs to have that buy-in. It isn't just a security problem, so it really needs that top-down approach, and that's probably one of the major challenges of a third-party risk management program, to have that business buy-in, so you've got the budget to do what you need to do.
That's interesting. So it's a lot more complex than it sounds at first, because as you look at managing that risk function, I mean, most people tend to think about risk monolithically as money, but there's a lot more to it than that. I heard you mention a couple of things: regulatory risk, making sure that with respect to things such as data sovereignty and ensuring that we're complying there; reputational risk. That's a big deal, because you can't really go to your customers and say, well, don't blame me. My third party screwed it up. So you should still love me and do business with me. Don't worry, we'll get a better third party next time. It doesn't work. And so what happens is that one of the things that I tell people is that you cannot delegate out that accountability for risk. You can't outsource that. That's something that must stay in house. And therefore, being able to have an effective program is a huge deal. And I think even more so as we look at a bigger threat that's out there, nation states going in there, moving into some areas in terms of perhaps outright espionage, let alone the traditional, usual cast of characters that are grabbing stuff and trying to make off with things, as well as just, of course, human error that takes place out there, and it's always going to occur. And so, from that perspective, then you had mentioned that you really kind of needed perhaps somebody else out there to help you out with this ecosystem. And there's a number of third-party risk solutions in this space. Is there anything that CISOs need to consider when selecting a vendor in this space?
Oh, definitely. And just, I guess, to touch on that brand management, I think a lot of organizations default to the legal structure. So we generally have contracts in place with our third parties, but that's really just a fallback position. So you do need to be able to have some skin in the game and do this correctly. You do need to focus on the controls beyond just the administrative controls like contracts. You can try and do this yourself as an organization. And depending on the size of the organization, I think, as a very small organization, you generally don't have the security specialists, you don't have the dollars to scale in terms of people to throw at this problem. As a very large organization, you might have more people and you might have more skills, but then you've also potentially got hundreds or thousands of more third-party relationships. So the challenge magnifies. So, as an organization, we tried to do it ourselves and soon realized that to do it properly, to do that appropriate due diligence when you're onboarding those third parties and to manage it as an ongoing program, we just couldn't scale to do that. So you do need to look at other options. The key is visibility. How can you possibly scale enough to maintain visibility of all of your partners, not just when you're onboarding through the procurement process, but also as an ongoing checkpoint in terms of a program? So how do you maintain your risk posture with those organizations? There's obviously lots of options out there in terms of third-party services that can help. There's the large consultant firms. They can come in and kind of do the lot for you, but then you lose that intellectual property to them. You don't have that level of awareness or engagement often into the rest of your business. There's lots of GRC tool options, and they're useful and important to leverage in terms of your risk management program, but can they do the extra bits in terms of third-party risk? There's risk scoring services, so there's a lot of outside-in scanning engines and services that can give you a rating. That's also an important component to your program, but in itself, it's probably not enough. So what we're looking for is an integrated service combining all of those. You need to be able to combine that into your partner security framework. Now, tool's not going to fix it alone, and a service on itself is not going to fix it alone. You do need to have that framework, and I know one of your earlier podcasts was certainly all about frameworks, and I would think that you need to be integrating into a typical NIST or ISO type framework. Most of those industry standards will have control domains covering third-party risk management. So when you're looking for a service, look for something that integrates the assessment activity, integrates the open source intelligence information that is available from the dark web, provides a platform that allows you to access the results of all of those activities and all of that information, and is mappable back into your existing framework so it can be integrated. It's not just something you use in isolation, it's something that forms a key component of your security framework.
Right. So what I'm hearing then is like three different types of players in the market. The larger consulting companies, they can use your version of the questionnaire. They'll go out, perform audits and assessments. Workflow tools like GRC systems, you can upload a questionnaire and then have someone go chase down the assessments. Or risk ranking companies, they're going to rely on doing their own scanning. They're going to come up with the information, etc. Now, one of the things that I have found as a CISO is that I will get somebody in the business will say, "Hey, G Mark, we got to have this thing filled out by tomorrow or Friday or something like that." And I look at it, and it's this multi-page long security questionnaire. Do you have this? Do you do that? Blah, 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 blah. And it's unique. I mean, every time it's just a little bit different than the one before. And I just like to have something that say like, "Hey, let me just cut and paste what I sent to the last guy." But nope, I got to roll up my sleeves because our job as CISOs is to support the business. We want to make sure that things get done effectively. So, okay, here we go, and off we run. But that's a lot of extra work. So it's then now this only happens once in a while, because one of the things that I'm kind of wondering is that you're with a larger organization, and so there's probably a gap between the number of suppliers that you actually do this due diligence on and the ones that you're actually relying upon. How big is this gap from the number of companies that we typically are actually taking a close look at?
Yeah, spot on, G Mark. I think until we really looked at the numbers and had to think about what we were doing, we probably didn't realize, and most companies probably go through this process, you don't realize how many different relationships you have as an organization. Most of us probably start with the very typical supply relationship. So we have procurement, We have a process to assess new vendors or new suppliers. We go through that procurement cycle. We do some due diligence, and it very much is a supplier-consumer relationship. But it's not just suppliers that have access to your data as an organization. Your customers even can have access to your data. So where you're a large service provider, you might have enterprise B2B processes or connections in place where you're sharing information. As a service provider of managed services, you might be providing information feeds to your customer. They might be getting access to your systems to see the progress of, could be anything, could be progress of orders, it could be the progress of an incident that's being managed, a fault that they've raised. So there's always going to be information sharing. So even customers potentially can be involved in exposing your data, or at least at the very least accessing your data. So once you start thinking about all those different relationships, we talked about regulators before, they're going to have obligated access or regulatory access in terms of your data so that they can do their job. You're going to have regulatory reporting obligations. We have relationships with our mergers and acquisitions, so we're going to be sharing data in terms of that due diligence process. So the size of your partner ecosystem suddenly starts to get very large. And I would think that if you're a typical supplier relationship, you might be looking at assessing maybe 5 to 10% of those traditional suppliers, which is very small. You need to start thinking about, all of those other things. You probably heard the term shadow IT. Well, there's definitely shadow procurement. It's can be relatively trivial for someone in an organization, especially a very large organization, to go out there and buy an instance on the cloud, buy their credit card and claim it as an expense, and then every month pay that off. How do you possibly pick that up? So we started, certainly it was the best we could think of as at the time, start with your accounts payable report. Pull a report from your financial systems to find out where the money's going. And then start with there. It won't be everything, and it won't pick up absolutely every version of relationship you might have, but it's a really good start. And then you can go through and whittle that down. Think about the chunks that you need to deal with, bite-sized pieces. So, for instance, supplies is a nice one. That's a nice, easy one to start with. Think about your top spend. So, who do you spend the most money with? Are they the most critical to your business? How much do you rely on them? Start with those suppliers and then work your way through your various other relationships.
I mean, this sounds like a huge challenge. If we were down at the 5 or 10% level, I mean, as you're mentioning that, what's I'm thinking of is like seatbelts in 1955. They weren't required, and in fact, I think you had to pay extra if you wanted to put them in your car. And yet today, we can see a significant improvement in highway safety because of the presence of this type of control. So this control, which looks to be largely absent, is one where I guess we've been driving around for years now without really having a good handle on this problem. And with the increase in the data protection regulations, both GDPR, for example, in Europe kicking in May of 2018, United States, California Consumer Privacy Act is kicking in on 2020, and then there's going to be other jurisdictions around the world that are all going to have their own versions. This is now we're not going to get a pass on it anymore. This is something that has to be addressed effectively by organizations. And because the failure of a third party, a partner or ecosystem, whatever, results in a data breach typically, or an outage maybe if they just lose your data, you can't get it back and you can't deliver. This falls squarely on the CISO, although we might not have been thinking about this in the past, which means that we're going to have to probably look for third-party tools and things like that. I mean, how do you see this space evolving?
You're right, G Mark. And look, I don't, maybe I've made it sound a lot more scary than it is. Look, it probably is scary, but like anything, large, trying to have a bite of an elephant, you need to start with the bite-sized chunks. So start with the things you have to do. So what are your biggest exposures? Certainly regulatory, there's some regulatory obligations. So as you touched on, GDPR, PCI DSS, if you're going through an ISO 27001 certification or you're complying with NIST, if you've got customers that expect you to meet certain standards, that's as good a place as anywhere to start in terms of understanding what the challenge is and how you might prioritize various aspects of your third-party risk management program. Look at your biggest spend. So work out what supplies you rely on the most to stay in business, because ultimately without those third parties, you won't stay in business. So you need to prioritize those. That's all part of that supply chain. Where this is moving to, as an organization, you might have a lot of customers. A lot of your customers will expect to see some level of due diligence as an organization yourself, plus with your third parties. How do you possibly share that information in a scalable sense? You touched on before about filling out hundreds of spreadsheets in response to customers requesting information about your security posture. You can use a service like an exchange type service that's used those assessments. You can fill one of those out yourself and use it as like a do once, use many approach without having to fill out multiple spreadsheets. I think as an industry, as many industries, we are all in this together. So we all need to work together to scale to meet this problem. Throwing spreadsheets around amongst ourselves is not going to help that. So we need to learn to work a little bit more smarter. Much of the data is available out there, but it is fairly selectively shared. So we might have a customer that asks us to fill out their security questionnaire. We fill that out, send it back to them. But how do we reuse that? So we've obviously got the data in the first place. How can we share that in many different forms to our other customers that want that same sort of information? So you need to look for a service that allows you to consolidate that data, correlate it into a form that can be then presented or mapped against a customer's requirements. Many customers, certainly enterprise customers out there, will align to, the typical frameworks, whether it's NIST or ISO, or they've got a PCI DSS requirement or GDPR requirement. So you need to look for a service that allows you to map that data, put it into responses aligned to those standards. And that's the way we've done it. You'll always get those customers that want us to fill out bespoke questionnaires, and you can't prevent that. But generally, when we're responding to those requests, we'll say, look, here's our assessment in a standard form. We can map it to any of your standards. Try that first. If you've got more information that you need us to provide you, we can do that as a secondary thing. And we're seeing a lot more of our customers are accepting that if we've got a standard response that covers all of those control categories aligned to a framework like NIST or ISO, generally that meets their requirements.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, you're almost flicking back onto the person who gave you this long questionnaire and saying, well, actually, our standard trumps your standard because we're using an international one. What are you using?
That's right, and I think it helps to sell the message or spread the word a little bit better in terms of there are better ways for us to do this. So it's can be frustrating, especially when you're responding to an RFP as an organisation when that potential customer sends you their internal standards and say you must comply with these. Well, in a lot of cases, yes, they're in your internal standards. So our security posture and our profiling is different. We need to put it in the framework of an industry standard aligned to the services that we're going to be offering. And I guess that's key. So understanding the security posture of your third party and the specific relationship you have with them will then frame what that risk looks like, and that'll help to drive your risk profiling that needs to meet your risk appetite. So context is key to all of this. I think something else that we're probably starting to see that will be useful is how do we leverage all of this third-party data? How do we leverage that in terms of an incident response? So if we have a zero-day attack, how can we go out there and drill down to our third parties and understand what our third party exposure might be? Which of those third parties didn't stack up so well in things like patch management or vulnerability management, or even didn't have the best handle on their assets, because obviously without understanding your assets, you're not going to be able to patch them effectively. So things like a zero-day attack, if you can find a service that allows you to filter against that particular control category, that will give you a heads up in terms of where your risk might be. And you can start having conversations with those third parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've hit on something that's really key, such as if something goes wrong, how far downstream or even from upstream did the problem? I mean, we've seen things, solar winds and other types of issues where supply chain attacks that could then get to second and third order effects. And one of the things that we like to do, I would think, is have that pretty good understanding of, well, actually, better than a good understanding, have a solid understanding of what your third parties are doing and where they stand. Now, the hard part often is that if you set a very high bar for doing this, we would probably never find anybody who qualifies. And that was some of the early issues way back when they set up some security standards, is it turns out that to be able to fully comply with the standard, you couldn't get any work done because everything was being controlled. And therefore, there needs to be some sort of a reference point, if you will, a benchmark, something that says, hey, how good is good enough? What is it that represents a sufficient level of, if you will, accomplishment that gives us a feel that our risk is acceptable? Now, granted, there's always going to be some risk, but there probably should be some sort of a reference point at which point we say, this is defensible. To get beyond this, if something goes wrong, it wasn't an everyday event. It was something, like you said, a 0 day, very difficult. Well, you can't really prevent against them. You can just detect and respond fast. But what are your thoughts from the perspective of setting some sort of standard or benchmark?
You definitely need to align to a standard. As you know, for good business, we all have shareholders, we have taxpayers. If you're a government entity, we have an obligation to manage risks associated with any transaction. The maturity can be measured against an industry standard. So look for things that will align or point to those industry standards. As an organization, you would go out there, look at third parties. You're probably familiar with Magic Quadrant analysis that'll help you with vendor selection around features and performance. But what about the security performance of those vendors? How do you actually measure that? How do we compare with the security posture of those vendors amongst themselves? So you need to look for a service that allows you to map against those standards, but also presents OSINT data, so data from the dark web, combines that with assessment data, ideally rated against a maturity level, against those control categories, and that ultimately maps to those industry standards. Without that, you can't compare. So the standards, I guess, gives you that baseline comparison. If you can find a service that allows you to map their responses from their assessments to those standards, you're in the best position of understanding what that risk posture might be. And you can work with your third parties to increase their maturity. It's not necessarily a black and white outcome. So, we have lots of suppliers that are different levels of maturity, and depending on what they're offering or providing to you as a service, you might accept a lower maturity. So, for instance, you're a supplier of stationery, unless they're going to supply you some sort of whiz-bang smart pen that could infiltrate your network and copy data. Generally, pens and papers and things like that, you're not going to expect the same level of cybersecurity maturity as opposed to a cloud provider where you're putting a lot of your core information assets. So you do need to understand that relationship, as I said, that context, because that will then drive the risk appetite that you're going to be comfortable with each individual relationship.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think about it from the perspective of a vendor, a seller, someone who is like a software company or something like that, and what you have is a situation where I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. You really don't want to have to do custom assessments every time you make a deal, right? And so, from that perspective, how do you go ahead and do that? How do we make this happen?
You need some common language, and I guess the common language is your typical security standards. But going back to that example that I had around the stationary supplier, you might decide that it's low enough risk in terms of information exposure. You don't need to put them through a full third-party risk management program, but you might do the basics. So you do that kind of outside-in passive analysis. You might have information where that is available in the dark web that will be fine for your risk appetite in terms of assessing their maturity. You may not need to go through the full assessment path. With a software vendor, for instance, you might want to focus on certain elements of that service in providing software to you. So for software, as you said, that supply chain in terms of how that software gets to you, how it's updated. So the whole secure software development lifecycle control category, that's probably going to be your main focus. How do they patch? How do they maintain development activity? Are they releasing regular hot fixes or regular patches to security vulnerabilities? Do they have a good program to, develop additional controls in their software, release that on a regular basis? So you might have a strong focus on your software development lifecycle for that particular vendor, as opposed to some other control categories which may not necessarily be relevant to that relationship. So you do need to focus in order to scale. It kind of sounds contradictory, but unless you understand the specific relationships with those organizations, you most likely can't do everything for everyone at the same level.
Yeah, yeah, I guess you do the best you can with what you've got. So I don't know, any other final thoughts here as we wrap up? Things that you think people might want to understand? I mean, you keep mentioning about finding a solution, and I think it's okay to mention if you found something that does work. I mean, this is obviously not an infomercial, but
we
I don't
we
mind.
we have definitely found a solution, and we have certainly great experience with the CyberGRX guys. We've looked and we have used other options as well. We have a very good working relationship with CyberGRX. They do tick the boxes in terms of integration with our program, and they do cover all of those elements we've touched on. So we've certainly had really good experience. We use them as a core part of our security framework. They are a service, they are a tool, and probably heard this from lots of different people. You can't just rely on a tool or service. You do need that framework. So you still need to start with the basics. You need to start with a top-down business level approach. It needs to be linked to standards, to your organizational policies. You need to choose a framework, a security framework like NIST or ISO or something similar, and it needs to be able to be integrated into that framework. So we use CyberGRX as just one of many tools in terms of our framework. In some cases, we do our own bespoke assessments, especially where there's specific context around our organization and the supplier. So if there's, for instance, a platform that we're relying on a supplier to stand up or build for us, then we're going to have some architectural requirements. We're going to want to understand some very specific technical controls. So there will always be other elements outside of that typical tool and service. You need to look at what you want to achieve outside of your overall third-party risk management program. Most organizations, as I said, don't have the capacity or capability or budget to be able to meet that challenge without some sort of assistance. You need to understand, what can you do with the skills and the people that you have versus what's out there that you can leverage. What's cost effective? Is there a service that is matured, that has support, that has some knowledge that can bring to your program that you can then leverage? So it's important that you understand what options there are out there. Make sure that you align to a recognized methodology. Make sure those services are able to be integrated and also aligned to those recognized methodologies. And don't forget to do due diligence on them as well. So, obviously we've gone through that process. We do due diligence and we use CyberDirects to do many of our assessments and provide our intelligence. We're also going to ask them the same sort of questions ourselves. We rely on them so heavily. So obviously you need to put them through that process as well.
Well, thank you, Scott. I mean, this has been fascinating because I think third party risk management is something that broaches from time to time in the CISO, but normally more is a workflow interruption. As I said, this is what happens with me when somebody says, "Hey, we're trying to close a deal and we need this," or "We're bidding this contract and we need this form filled out." But what you're saying then is that there are vendors out there that provide that infrastructure. And in a way, I kind of like that idea because then what we can move toward is having a standards based repository of risk rating information relative to third parties so that one can do the due diligence and, for example, as a CISO, even be part of a pursuit team to say, hey, we're looking at doing this type of business or working with these companies. What do you foresee as a potential risk? And if there's enough of that information out there and it's shareable, then it really goes a long way toward helping the CISO be part of the business team, which is ultimately where the C comes into in that chief role, is that you're part of the leadership team and not simply a technical expert. We could probably go on and talk all night on this, and or all morning for you, actually. We've got about a 14-hour time difference. I do thank you for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating. And for folks who are listening in, I want to thank you for being a subscriber to the CISO Tradecraft podcast. As always, we encourage you to follow us. You can either track us on LinkedIn or go to our CISOTradecraft.com website and get the latest of the episodes. I think for today, that should wrap it up. This is G. Mark Hardy, along with my special guest, Scott Fairbrother. Thank you very much. And till next time, stay safe out there.